The Amish don't have a fly problem. Walk into one of their barns in Lancaster County on a July afternoon, animals packed in, heat sitting heavy, manure present, and you expect to be swarmed. You're not. A USDA Rural Extension observer noted it in field records from the early 1990s and couldn't explain it. No spray cans, no electric zappers, no coils burning in the corner. Just a system so old and so simple that the rest of us stopped seeing it entirely. And you can run it on a quarter acre. Starting this week. That observation didn't make it into any consumer guidance. It didn't make it into any home improvement guide or pest control manual. And there's a reason for that, but we'll get to the reason. Because first, you need to understand what was actually happening inside those barns. And once you see it, you will not be able to unsee it. Here is what the extension observers noticed. Dense animal operations, summer heat, all the biological conditions that should produce a fly explosion, and almost none, not reduced, almost none. The farms that had been running the same management approach for generations were operating with fly pressure so low it looked like a controlled experiment. It wasn't. It was just a system that worked, one that had been passed down not as folk magic, but as practical farm logic refined over more than a century of daily use. No single trick explains it. That's the first thing to understand. The Amish fly system is not a hack. It's a three-part method that works, because each element addresses a different stage of the fly's life cycle. Remove one part, and the other two still help. Run all three together, and the population doesn't build. It collapses before it starts. Stay with me, because this is where it changes. The first part is a repellent perimeter. Basil, tansy, and elderberry planted or bundled and placed at doorways, window lines, and entry points. Flies navigate almost entirely by scent. Their olfactory systems are calibrated to find food, waste, and breeding sites. These plants produce volatile compounds that interfere with that navigation. The flies don't die, they redirect. They move away from the treated threshold and look elsewhere. The house, the kitchen, the barn door, those spaces become less interesting to them because the scent signal they need to locate food and breeding material gets drowned out. This is not a folk theory. It is basic insect biology. But the Amish didn't need a research paper to confirm it. They had 70 years of working barns. The second part is a fermented bait draw, a jar, vinegar, a rotting fruit core, maybe a splash of water, simple. Placed not near the living area, but away from it, 15 to 20 feet out, downwind, positioned toward the edge of the property. This is the detail that matters. Most people who try to trap flies put the trap near the problem. That pulls flies through the space you're trying to protect. The Amish put the draw away at the perimeter. The bait is more attractive than anything else on the property, so flies move toward it away from the barn, away from the kitchen, away from the animals. It sounds almost too obvious. It works because the logic is correct. The third part is timing. And this is the one nobody talks about. Fly populations don't appear. They build. A female housefly lays eggs in organic waste manure, food scraps, wet debris, and those eggs hatch into larvae within 24 hours. The larvae mature into pupae. The whole cycle from egg to flying adult takes roughly 4 to 6 days under warm conditions. But here is the number that matters. The breeding cycle cannot complete if the waste material is removed within 72 to 96 hours. 4 days. Remove waste before day 4, and you have interrupted the loop before it can produce a new generation. Do that consistently, and fly populations don't recover. They can't. The reproductive chain keeps breaking. The University of Minnesota Agricultural Experiment Station documented this in 1952, not as a discovery, as a confirmation of what rural communities had already known. Their field tests showed that consistent short-cycle waste removal produced fly population collapses that no spray regime at the time could match in sustained effect. The spray killed the flies that existed. The timing discipline prevented the next generation from existing at all. If that was documented in 1952, why are you hearing about it for the first time right now? That question has an answer. But before we get there, Notice something sitting in the background of a 1978 USDA Rural Living Survey photograph, a photo taken in a Pennsylvania Amish barn for a study on agricultural housing. In the background, partially out of frame, there's an object hanging near the door threshold. A bundle. Something tied below it. The photograph caption doesn't name it. The survey doesn't reference it. It's just there. Hold that image. We'll come back to it. Because first, you need to understand that none of this started with the Amish. The Amish preserved it. But this was once mainstream American household knowledge. Pull up a copy of The Farm and Household Cyclopedia from the 1880s. Fly management is a chapter. Not a footnote. A chapter. The methods described repellent herbs at entry points, bait placement away from living spaces, short-cycle waste removal are the same methods. The vocabulary is older, but the logic is identical. By the 1890s, Country Gentleman magazine was running regular features on fly control that treated these techniques as standard household competence, something every farm family was expected to know. This was not fringe knowledge. This was not a regional quirk. For 40 years, from roughly 1880 to 1920, this system, or something very close to it, was considered normal, practical, expected. Something you learned the same way you learned to preserve food or manage a water supply. And then something happened. Not slowly, not gradually. Something shifted in a specific window of time. And by 1950, almost none of it was in any public-facing agricultural guidance anymore. The question is not whether it disappeared. The question is what moved in to replace it, and whether that replacement had anything to do with the fact that the old system was free. Here is the part nobody tells you. After World War II, American chemical manufacturers were sitting on enormous production capacity built for wartime. DDT had been used in the Pacific Theater to control malaria-carrying mosquitoes. It worked fast, and it looked spectacular. Back home, the same companies that had supplied the war effort began marketing chemical pesticide solutions to the domestic agricultural and household market, aggressively. Strategically, they did it with USDA cooperation. There are 1,947 agreement records documenting the relationship between regulatory bodies and pesticide manufacturers. And they did it through media. Farm Journal, Life magazine, full-page advertisements positioning spray-based pest control as scientific, modern, and safe. And positioning the older methods, the herb lines, the fermented bait draws, the timing discipline as backward, as something your grandmother did because she didn't know any better. Not because they were less effective, not because any study had demonstrated they were inferior, because they did not generate repeat sales. The fermented bait jar is a mason jar. You fill it once. The tansy bundle is a plant. You grow it or harvest it once a season. The 4-day removal cycle costs nothing except consistency. There is no product to run out of, no refill to buy, no seasonal restocking. The old system was not a market. And what is not a market tends to disappear from the conversation when the conversation is being shaped by people who need markets. That is not a conspiracy. That is a business logic. Simple, cold, and entirely effective. But the business logic only explains the motive. What actually happened to the knowledge, how it got buried specifically, not just generally, that requires following a name most people have never heard. Dr. Leland Ossian Howard, USDA entomologist. Working out of Washington in the early 1900s, at a time when the agency was still treating rural household knowledge as something worth documenting rather than replacing. Howard spent years cataloging non-chemical pest reduction methods across rural townships, not as curiosities, but as functioning systems. His published work from that period references plant-based repellent strategies, bait placement logic, and breeding cycle interruption as legitimate tools with measurable results. His name appears in agricultural citations from 1902 through the early 1930s, and then, quietly, it stops appearing in extension curricula. His methods don't get disproven. They don't get tested and found wanting. They just stop being passed forward. By the 1950s, extension agents trained on his work were retiring, and the agents replacing them were being trained on a new curriculum, one built around chemical inputs as the primary solution framework. That is not an accident. That is a transition. And transitions like that don't happen in a vacuum. Stay with me, because this is where the pattern becomes undeniable. In 1961, the Ohio State Agricultural Extension Office produced an internal memo, not a published paper, not a public report, an internal document flagging something the field agents had started noticing. Farmers who were still running what the memo called old multi-method systems were consistently reporting lower fly pressure than farmers who had switched entirely to spray-based control. Lower. Not equivalent. Lower. The memo suggested further study. It was never published. It was never distributed to farmers or included in any consumer guidance. It sat in an archive. The 4-day breeding cycle disruption that the 1,952 Minnesota study confirmed was redocumented 30 years later. In 1983, Environmental Entomology, a peer-reviewed journal, published findings on fly population dynamics that confirmed what the Amish and the old farm manuals and Howard's field notes had all pointed toward. Interrupt the reproductive cycle before completion, consistently, and fly populations cannot sustain themselves. The paper was read by entomologists. It was not translated into anything a homeowner could use. It did not appear in pest control guidance. It did not make it into a single product or a single mainstream publication aimed at the general public. 3 separate moments. 1,952. 1,961. 1,983. 3 separate contexts, confirming the same basic system. None of it reaching you. Here is the part that should make you angry, not in a theatrical way, in a precise way. The spray you buy works. That is not in dispute. It kills the flies that are present at the moment of application, but it does nothing to the breeding cycle. The next generation is already in the organic material before you reached for the can. You spray, the flies die, the eggs hatch, the new adults emerge, you spray again. The cycle continues because the spray is designed to address the symptom, not the source. And a product that addresses symptoms requires perpetual repurchase. A method that addresses the source does not. That is the geometry of the situation, not malice in the dramatic sense, just the quiet arithmetic of who benefits when the older knowledge stays out of circulation. Now go back to that photograph. The 1,978 USDA Rural Living Survey image. The object near the barn door threshold, the bundle, the thing tied below it. You can identify it now. It's a tansy bundle. Dried, tied tight, hung at the door frame at roughly shoulder height to maximize the volatile compound dispersal in the airflow moving through the entrance. Below it, partially visible, is a small jar. The fermented bait draw. Positioned at the threshold rather than inside the barn drawing. Flies out, not in. The placement is precise, not decorative, functional. That exact arrangement, tansy bundle above, fermented draw below, positioned at the primary entrance threshold, is described in an 1,897 Pennsylvania German household guide. Word for word, the logic is the same. The photograph captures a living practice that runs in an unbroken line from the 19th century to 1,978, documented by the USDA in a rural living survey, and then filed away, without note, without explanation, without the caption even naming what is visible in the frame. Someone was still doing it. The camera recorded it. Nobody said a word about it. And here is what that means for you right now. This system does not require land. It does not require money. It does not require anything you cannot source locally or grow yourself. Tansy is a common perennial. It spreads aggressively, which means once you have it, you have it. Basil grows in a pot on a windowsill. Elderberry, if you want the third layer of the repellent perimeter, grows as a shrub along fence lines and needs almost no maintenance. The fermented bait jar takes 5 minutes to set up. Vinegar, a piece of overripe fruit, a mason jar with a few small holes in the lid, that's the entire investment. The placement matters more than the materials. Repellent plants at door frames, window lines, and any opening into the living space or animal area. The bait jar 15 to 20 feet away from those openings, downwind, toward the perimeter of the property, not near the problem. At the edge of the property, pulling flies away from it. And then the 4-day cycle. Remove organic waste food scraps, animal waste, wet compost material before day 4. Not once in a while. Consistently. Every 4 days during warm months. That is the cycle that breaks the breeding loop. The other 2 elements reduce the adult population. The timing discipline prevents the next generation from arriving. Run all 3. And you are doing exactly what those Lancaster County farms were doing when the extension observers walked through and couldn't explain what they were seeing. The Amish did not hide this. They did not guard it or protect it or keep it secret out of any deliberate choice. They simply never stopped doing it. While the rest of the country was handed a spray can and told that was progress, they kept running the system that worked. And when the spray stopped working as well as advertised, when resistance built, when populations rebounded faster, when the costs added up, the Amish farms just kept producing the same results they always had. They didn't protect the knowledge. They just never let anyone sell them out of it. That is the difference. And now you have it too. You are not someone who reaches for the product first and asks questions later. You are someone who wants to understand why the product exists before deciding whether you need it. That instinct is correct. That instinct is exactly what this kind of knowledge requires to survive. So tell me, have you ever tried a plant-based barrier around your doors or windows? Even accidentally basil on a windowsill? Herbs near an entrance? Did it seem like something was working, but you couldn't explain why? Drop it in the comments. Because the patterns people notice without knowing why they're noticing them, that's usually where the real buried knowledge lies. And if you think this is the only Amish system that got quietly sidelined, stay close. Because what they worked out for garden pest control involves no spray, no netting, and one companion planting arrangement that commercial growers have been aware of for decades. Aware of and actively uninterested in promoting. Because it cuts chemical input costs by 40% and generates exactly 0 repeat sales. That one is even older, and it works even better.